For a game as human and personal as 2013's The Last of Us is, it's ironic that discussions about the game's ending almost always regress into arguments about abstract ethics. There is this tendency amongst fans to frame the ending as being a simple trolley train dilemma, with the choice being between saving Ellie or saving the world. Now, while these arguments are interesting and can provide some insight into the themes of the game, they also tend to miss the broader spirit of the ending. The Last of Us depicts a largely amoral world. Almost none of its characters think primarily in moral terms, least of all its antagonists, and the world itself seems completely devoid of any justice or karma. This game is saying something really interesting and profound with its closing chapter, but I don't believe ethics is the best tool to use in understanding that message. If we want to understand what The Last of Us is saying, we need to understand the game on its own terms, and frame its ending within the same frame that the game consistently uses. And as this story is almost entirely character-focused, the best starting point to properly frame its ending is through its characters, beginning with the Fireflies. The Last of Us has this habit of being really creative and inventive with narrative tropes that are otherwise very overdone in video games, and the Fireflies are a great example of this in action. They're a radical revolutionary group trying to topple an authoritarian system, and that description alone could apply to groups in all of these other video games. But none of those other games explore this trope in as thorough and nuanced a way as The Last of Us does. And though the Fireflies have little screen time throughout the game, they serve a massive narrative purpose. While we don't ever get a detailed creed explaining the Fireflies' beliefs, we do hear enough of their perspectives to know that they are anti-authoritarianism, radical in the means they are willing to use, and have a very utopian worldview. Their main goal is saving the world, both from Fedra and from the infected, and they are obsessively committed to this goal, to the point that they arguably blind themselves from reason. A common argument against the surgery doesn't even use ethics. It simply argues that the Fireflies were really doing junk science, and that even if they did harvest the cordyceps from Ellie's brain, they wouldn't have been able to create a vaccine. And there is textual support to this argument. Marlene makes it sound like Ellie is their guaranteed key towards saving the world, but her recordings and diary don't exactly portray a mental state capable of cold, unbiased analysis.
Apparently there's no way to extricate the parasite without eliminating the host. The tests just keep getting harder and harder, don't they? I'm so tired. I'm exhausted. And I just want this to end. So be it.
And this is who the Fireflies are consistently throughout the game. They're a classical example of ideologues, people so committed to their cause that they become blinded to reality. And that's obviously happening here, whether or not you think this, in a vacuum, is a moral trade-off to make. Ultimately, the Fireflies' worldview, on top of producing irrationality, appears very unsatisfying. Tommy seems to regret his time spent with them, and this Firefly does not mince words about his regrets.
Got me some time to reflect. Been years that felt like we were... fucking thing was a giant waste of time.
And yet, if this is a waste of time, what isn't? This is a common aspect of apocalypse stories that I have always loved. These stories strip humanity of all societal achievements and comforts, and forces its characters to confront what really matters. The Last of Us in particular has this hauntingly existential feel to it. There is this instinctual desire for meaning and purpose that every character is trying to satisfy throughout this story. We've already seen that the Fireflies fail to find meaning through their ideology. What about other characters? Bill lives his life of egoism and isolation, and we see how that ends for him. A metaphysical punch in the gut of regret and sadness. David has his whole survival of the fittest approach, and that ends with him getting a physical machete punching through his guts. The common element behind all these failed worldviews is a lack of any human element. Whether it's the Fireflies bombing innocent civilians, Bill casting away his companion, or David cannibalizing people, each puts their specific principles far and away above individual human lives. Now, if you want to talk about an opposite approach to these worldviews, let's talk about Joel. For how depraved and decadent as this world is, there's still so much life and vibrance on display as well. The Last of Us has this constant insistence that, no matter how beaten down the human race is, there's still something fundamentally valuable about us and our relationships. And that recognition is ultimately what gives its characters meaning and purpose. The Last of Us may be dark, and often bleak, but it's anything but nihilistic. Its narrative is constantly reinforcing the idea that real, satisfying meaning can be found through our relationships, even in a world that looks like this. And every character intuits this to some degree. All the note cards you find scattered throughout the world treat the apocalypse almost like a footnote. The subject matter of their writing is never the infected. It's always how their father or sister or companion has gone away, and they don't know if or when they'll ever see them again. And then there's Joel and Ellie, who together almost personify this principle of finding meaning through others. Their father-daughter relationship forms the soul of The Last of Us, and it's the sphere in which the game's warmest moments happen. Ellie being unable to hide her smile when Joel agrees to take her to Colorado. Joel finally agreeing to hold on to the photo of him and Sarah, the iconic giraffe scene. Really, the sentiments are treated with so much reverence throughout this game, and are shown to have a lot of power. It's only through empathy that Joel and Ellie begin to grow closer to each other. For how different they are, they need to put themselves in the other's shoes to see the other person as a person. Even the player is invited into these sentiments, in a very fitting way for an interactive story. The brief sections spent playing as Ellie do a lot of work in giving the player her perspective and point of view. It's a big juxtaposition to go from a hulking man capable of giving and taking a beating, to a frail young girl whose main goal in encounters is just to hide. These sections underscore so much of Ellie's character. So that's it. This is the game's answer into the question of what really matters. Once again, this isn't exactly a new idea. You can find this sort of message in media all across the ages, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a story that expresses this in as convincing, satisfying, and emotionally resonating way as The Last of Us does. Now, all that being said, we still have to address all the death lingering in this game. The Last of Us displays a real power that relationships have in conquering grief, redeeming people, and bringing us joy. But even so, death still has its inevitable hour. And that's the tragic story being told over and over and over again throughout this game. The Last of Us is a tale of people finding purpose and beauty and joy in an incredibly fragile foundation. Human mortality is a weight that looms over every character in The Last of Us, and every facet of the game reinforces it. Whether it's Joel's manic, almost terrifying sounding gasp for air he makes whenever sprinting, the way enemies struggle for life when being choked out, or the piles of graves, memorials, and corpses you find scattered throughout America. For Joel's part, that reality of death is his driving fear throughout the entire game. It drives his cynicism for the possibility of a vaccine. It's the reason he's so scared to grow close to Ellie, and when he finally does lean into that fatherly role, it's what pushes him to do anything for the sake of protecting her, even if it means destroying the foundations that others have built their lives around. And that's the ending of The Last of Us. It's a character doing everything he can, crossing every boundary, to defend a foundation that's already fleeting and incredibly fragile. The same sentiments that once appeared beautiful now come off as almost horrifying.
Come on, baby girl. I got you. I got you.
The Last of Us is a game of sharp contrast. The art direction is built around contrasting dark and light colors. Nature is depicted to be beautiful and also horrifying, and its characters show off the best and worst aspects of being human. There's this constant push to simplify this game down to either being a warm-hearted tale of love conquering grief, or a Shakespearean tragedy condemning sentiment. But really, it's both. You can't understand this story or its characters without fully considering both the warmth and the coldness depicted, and how the two paradoxically complement each other. The warmest moments are only so pure because we know what precedes them, and yet those same moments are stained by what happens next. Joel is of course full of contrast between light and dark. We know he's capable of doing some horrifying things, but his motivations are some of the most relatable and human you'll ever find in a video game character. Is there anything beyond this cycle of love and death? Is there a firmer foundation for these characters to cling to? Only a couple of times throughout the game, a character asks whether their lives have a meaning beyond themselves and their relationships. They express this yearning for a kind of justice and purpose that transcends any human life. It's always posed in a way that sounds just a bit like the Fireflies ideology, but with a subtly existential aura to it. It's what Ellie seems to be questioning throughout the game's final chapter.
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
Are these characters justified in yearning for this type of meaning? Does it even exist? Ultimately, The Last of Us doesn't have an answer to that question. Honestly, it seems that the game itself is trying to work out what it believes.
It was her. She fought like hell to get here. Maybe it was meant to be.
I lost most of my crew crossing the country. I pretty much lost everything. And then you show up and somehow we find you just in time to save her. Maybe it was meant to be.